Hi everyone, and welcome to Autoethnography as Personal Positioning and Introduction. First, I want you to think about autoethnography as researcher positioning, because while autoethnography now is a very established method that goes across social science disciplines, it's in communication studies, it's in sociology, it's in education, we want to talk about that it was only about 30 years ago that it wasn't considered a mode of inquiry, but it has a rich history of how it became a mode of inquiry. First, let's talk about positivism and the Enlightenment, and this began in 1715. And it was this idea that after the plague had ended, people wanted to discover new knowledge. And they created the scientific method, steps of how you designed a study, and you could go through and find out knowledge about the world. And this worked for biology, and it worked for chemistry, and it worked for physics. There was a hypothesis, and you proved it or you didn't. You either could replicate it or you could not. There was this truth that we could go out there and find. And social scientists, those interested in psychology and sociology in the beginning, said, I think we can also do this with individual experience. And so they tried to predict how human beings would behave through designing studies. And we still do this. There are still lots of positive researchers out there that try to predict people from this particular demographic and these particular bodies, when faced with this situation, will react in this way. However, we found that overall, people are much less predictable than atoms, and it's very difficult to predict our behavior. But a post-positivist, someone who still believes positivism is the best way to approach inquiry, would say, well, we can't get an exact answer, but we can get pretty close. There's very little margins of error. But interpretivism and critical inquiry began in the 1900s. And there was this idea of, no, human beings can't be predicted, but they can be deeply understood. So there was this idea, no, we want to go in depth and study individuals and their cultures and how they make meaning. And from here, we move from not just studying other cultures, but also our own stories, and that started in the 1990s. So, think about classic ethnography. And classic ethnography is what first rose as a backlash from Enlightenment and this idea of positivism. And it emerges from anthropology. It thought we can go and observe a culture from a distance. Usually they would go really far away. They would be in Africa or in the depths of Asia, trying to understand people different from their own. They tried to observe without getting emotionally involved, and they would bring back these exotic stories of others. Now, critical ethnography, which again began in the 1990s, just a little bit before autoethnography, said, we don't need that to be so distant. We don't need to not be emotionally involved. It's okay to get deeply involved. And this began with Dwight Conquergood. And what Dwight Conquergood told us we needed to do is we needed to start thinking about how we could immerse ourselves and become part of a culture. And he said, this isn't disrupting the culture, because we can never truly be objective anyway. We're all subjective beings, right? And this idea of pushing against positivism, that we can really only understand experience. We can't objectively get outside of our bodies to understand it. And so with this comes this idea of critical ethnography. And so how Dwight Conquergood did this was he went to a particular housing building that was known to be very low income subsidized housing that was run down. And he lived in that building in Chicago while he was a professor at Northwestern, and he did an ethnography on that building. Later, he worked and followed a gang, in one of the most violent gangs of Chicago, and told their story with them. They collaborated in what they would like him to tell others. So there is this idea of self-reflexivity. We can't be objective, we can't be detached. We can think about the biases we have. We can think about why we might feel the way we do. And this means disclosing our personal, social, and cultural locations. It's expected, at times even required, to say, who are you? Remember, our bodies are collecting this data, and people want to know our motivations. Why did that matter? So, autoethnography, by definition, auto is self, ethno is human beings, graphy is field of study. So it's the study of one's own humanity situated in culture, that story of our own body. and what it means to live through our body and culture. There's this idea that we gaze back and forth. We gaze at our experience, we gaze at the culture our body is in, and how we're struggling to create and resist meaning with others. So there is this idea, autoethnography as understanding. You understand yourself because stories are how we make sense of this world. What pieces of our day-to-day existence have we decided are meaningful that we're going to section off and tell other people? Why did it matter? Why did you choose it? How did this particular experience become a defining moment in who you are? You understand culture. You understand who you are and who you're not, based on the stories you tell and the role of others. Who is there? Who is not? I think often at this time of, I'm an Italian American. I am a second generation born in this country. My grandparents are from Italy. So I always thought myself as American, but really an Italian American, that I was deeply Italian. Well, in college, I went off. I decided to live in a convent in Italy, and I was expecting to really resonate with that culture. But I found that it was a little bit slow for me. The idea of things shutting down, the fact that Catholicism dictated the entire calendar and the entire day was a lot for me, as I met not only in the convent, but in the greater Italian culture. I found that Catholicism was just deeply present. And my family wasn't Catholic, and I felt very much like an outsider in this space. And while people often would see me and say, yeah, you do look Italian, you look like you're from this region, they realized very quickly with how I dressed, how I spoke, my priorities, I wasn't Italian. I was American, so that was a bit of a wake-up call for me at 20. Also this idea, we can understand our positioning. Your age, gender, sexuality, race, region, size, social class, ability, and etc. There's so many other things we can look at. Your identity as an athlete, your identity as a person who is in a particular club or subculture, all this idea, you have identity markers that people see you and they have preconceived notions of what it means to be part of that group, and you understand how power and culture interacts with how people respond to you. Also, others understand themselves and others through your story. We have empathy, that phenomenological experience that we also can get from listening to another's story and interpreting their story. We get that through telling our story, and then others are able, as the listeners, to understand more about themselves, both how they might respond to a body that's different than their own, or how they might identify, wow, that's my experience too. That's why when we talk about coming out stories within LGBT culture, the idea of coming out narratives become something we tell a lot because people resonate with them. They understand, yes, that's an important chapter in this particular story for many people. So even those who have never had to come out, there is this idea of accessing that experience through listening to the stories of others. We can understand what it might be like to be in another situation, because while we can't be in another body, we can experience empathy as being a listener to a story. Also think of this as the merger of art and science. It's an analytic social science, but it's an expressive art and creative writing and telling the stories of your body. We're able to have that tension of somewhere between science and art in our research. So here's some fundamentals of good story writing. Have people depicted as characters. Help us know and see these other people you're interacting with. Have some sort of tension that's driving the story. Don't just have description. Move us through events where there's a tension that we can feel of the motivation of what you're trying to resolve, interpret, understand by telling the story. The most important thing here is movement through space and time. Make sure it might just be an interaction, right? It might just be 5 minutes, but you don't want to just describe. You want a conversation to be taking place, an interaction to be happening, and a point and a moral. What are we learning about living through your body by your telling the story? Remember, and this is back a bit of review, that idea of stories are visceral. Take a moment that you really remember because it was significant. You felt that sink, that swelling, that rise of of anxiety. What was it you felt that made you decide you're going to tell this story? It could also be that swelling of pride, right? It doesn't have to be a negative experience. Many people tell stories of positive experiences of empowerment, of being within their bodies. So think of the story you want to tell. It's collaborative. Living and telling stories is work. So be mindful as you're crafting other characters for your audience. Help your audience access and understand this situation. Give us enough details that we can be with you and feel it with you. So guide us through your emotional experience by recreating it for us on the page. And also be open to change. It might be through talking through this process, meanings and understandings shift and move, and you see life in a different way. And that's okay. It's okay for your meanings to change, because stories are susceptible. What you might have thought your original motivation for telling the story, and then by the time you're doing your artist statement and analyzing it, it might be different, and that's fine. Also, remember the performative utopia, the power of personal story to help us imagine a better world than the one we're in. So make sure we're able to see, here's what's like living through our body, and then be able to think of how could the world be more inclusive, more open, better than it can be. Why is this story important to tell? Here's just some notes for writing for the ear, because we're so used to writing essays. Read sentences out loud. They should be short and easy to say without stumbling. If they are not, rewrite it so it sounds like you. Remember how we honor the voice of another when we're performing someone else's story. But this one's yours. So it's okay to rewrite so it sounds like a very highly polished version of you. Keep details strategic and brief. Let the action move the story, and details are giving us sensory experience, emotional reaction, but aren't analyzing. And analysis shouldn't be happening in a good story. That analysis is going to happen later in your artist statement. Write succinct, pay attention to your word count. We do this by word count with this, and look and see how long should this story be. That's part to keep your audience engaged, and it's also to keep you engaged. You want to ensure that you are going to be able to enrapture someone in a storytelling event, and part of that is keeping it brief. All that extra detail, you have time to talk about that in the artist statement of what you left out and why. And then follow the rules for a great self-recorded performance. I have those step by step. Think about, as you're doing your artist statement, why did you choose this content? What performance decisions did you make? Why does this matter to us culturally? What do we learn, not just about you, but about bodies like yours situated in culture from telling this story? And that's all I have. You will be taking all of this information and applying it to an amazing storytelling event. I can't wait.